Okay, picture a puppy in a shop window. Paws up on the glass, tail going like a metronome. Now picture a golden retriever, sprinting across a field in slow motion, tongue out, pure joy, zero overhead. You own a piece of that. A business built on unconditional love, selling happiness for a living. Your fortune in the pet industry? It lives in every purchase that happens after the animal comes home. The animal itself is, honestly, practically a loss leader. The puppy in the window is the free trial. Everything that happens for the next 10, 15 years, that's the subscription. And you don't get to cancel it because something in your chest won't let you. Here's what buying into that subscription machine costs. In full. Back in 1860, a traveling salesman named James Spratt watched stray dogs in London eating leftover ship biscuit off the riverbank. And, he had an idea: bake dogs their own biscuit, charge real money for it, and sell it to people who wanted to believe their dog deserved better than garbage off the street. He built Spratt's meat fibrine dog cakes out of wheat, beetroot, and a mystery meat source he refused to name for the rest of his life. The ingredients were cheap. What Spratt spent his real money on was status, full-page ads in the earliest dog show programs, testimonials from wealthy country gentlemen, a young salesman named Charles Cruft, whom Spratt hired to work the dog show circuit, who later started a little competition called Crufts. The entry cost of the modern pet industry wasn't a factory, it was convincing people that table scraps were beneath their dog. A century and a half later, you'd pay to get into this business in a way that looks a lot more like a spreadsheet. But the underlying logic hasn't moved an inch for you any more than it did for Spratt. Whoever owns the ongoing relationship with the pet owner owns the business, regardless of who technically owns the animal. In January of 2017, the confectionery and pet food giant Mars bought the veterinary chain VCA for somewhere around $9 billion, at a price close to 15 times VCA's annual earnings. 2 years after that, the investment group JAB Holdings paid somewhere around $1.2 billion for a hospital network called Compassion First. And underneath both of those headline deals sits a much bigger, quieter one. Thousands of individual veterinary practices getting bought up by private equity-backed consolidators, one clinic at a time, typically for somewhere around 8 to 12 times the clinic's annual profit. Private equity and corporate ownership of American veterinary clinics has climbed from somewhere around 1 in 12 clinics a decade and a half ago to somewhere close to half of them today. A shift most pet owners walking into their local clinic have no idea happened at all. The mechanism behind those steep prices matters more than the prices themselves. Buyers pay 8, 12, even 16 times annual profit for a veterinary clinic, because pet owners keep coming back on a schedule, recession or no recession, in a way that few other small businesses can promise. You're buying a subscriber list that renews itself out of guilt and love, dressed up as a building full of exam tables. That same recession-resistant logic once justified the biggest leverage buyout of its year. In 2015, a private equity consortium led by BC Partners took the retail chain PetSmart private for somewhere around $8.7 billion, close to 9 times its annual profit, financing most of that price with borrowed money, the way most leveraged buyouts do. 2 years later, the newly private PetSmart used still more debt to buy the online retailer Chewy for somewhere around $3.35 billion, then spun Chewy back out through its own public stock offering a couple of years after that. PetSmart itself kept somewhere around $8 billion of debt sitting on its books the whole time, and credit rating agencies eventually downgraded that debt to distressed territory. Recession-resistant demand still has to service its interest payments on schedule, whether the storefront on top of it is thriving or just barely getting by. Now, here's the cost driver that catches almost every new owner off guard. Ready? A pound of ordinary dry kibble runs somewhere around $1 to $2. A pound of premium freeze-dried food, made from broadly similar cuts of meat, can run somewhere north of $20, even $30 a pound. Raw meat, bought directly from a butcher, costs somewhere around $1 to $2 a pound. The same cuts, freeze-dried and bagged under a boutique label? 4 to 6 times that. None of that gap comes from nutrition, zero. It comes from the same playbook Spratt invented in 1860, a story about purity, about your pet deserving better, wrapped around ingredients that stayed the cheap part of the equation the whole time. Whoever owns the story that convinces a customer to trade up a tier owns the actual margin in this business. Whoever only owns the ingredients is competing on pennies. Acquiring the business is only your entry fee. Owning a piece of this industry means you keep paying, year after year, for a workforce that arrives already carrying an enormous personal cost. The average new veterinarian graduates with somewhere around $170,000 to $200,000 in student debt, against a starting salary somewhere around $125,000 to $130,000 a year. A debt load close to a year and a half of income before a single paycheck even clears. That debt doesn't sit only on the veterinarian's shoulders, it gets built into what you have to charge at the front desk, because nobody stays in a profession that can't service its own tuition bill. Below the veterinarians, your turnover problem only deepens. Frontline veterinary staff, technicians, receptionists, kennel workers, turnover at somewhere around 30 to 40% a year, roughly double the turnover rate of the average American workplace. And replacing a single one of them can cost you anywhere from $10,000 to close to $100,000 once lost productivity and training time get counted. Add that up across your whole clinic staff, and turnover alone can quietly eat somewhere around 3 to 8% of your entire annual revenue, a cost you'll rarely see itemized anywhere. Layer the imaging equipment, the surgical suites, the anesthesia monitoring gear on top of all that. Machines that cost roughly the same whether they're scanning a chihuahua or a person, since the physics of an X-ray or an ultrasound doesn't care what species is lying on the table, and your payroll and equipment bill looks a lot heavier than the tail-wagging marketing suggests. Some of your spending buys you nothing you can point to on an invoice, and you fund it anyway, because the alternative is losing your customers' trust entirely. Pet food is chemically almost interchangeable between a $10 bag and a $60 bag, so the $60 brand spends heavily on packaging, influencer partnerships, and the same kind of aspirational advertising Sprat pioneered on dog show programs 160 years ago, just to keep a customer from trading down. Industry surveys now describe this whole shift with a single word: humanization. Pet owners, increasingly, shopping for their animals the way they shop for a family member: birthday treats, orthopedic beds, grain-free everything, and every brand in the category has to keep funding that emotional positioning, or watch a competitor take the shelf space instead. Pet insurers spend heavily underwriting policies where a large share of pet owners end up filing no claim that ever comes close to justifying the premium, purely to be the trusted name a panicked owner calls at 11 at night. And after any brush with a contamination scandal, quality testing and recall insurance premiums become a permanent, non-negotiable line item, with no upside of their own beyond staying in business at all. Your business sits inside a supply chain you don't fully control, and that chain can turn against you with no warning at all. In the spring of 2007, dozens of pet food makers, the Canadian manufacturer Menu Foods among the hardest hit, recalled somewhere around 60 million cans and pouches, sold under close to 100 different store and brand names, after a Chinese supplier had been spiking wheat gluten with melamine, an industrial chemical, to fake higher protein readings on lab tests. The contamination slipped past standard testing entirely. Nobody in North America was cutting a corner. The corner got cut on the other side of the planet, inside an ingredient nobody outside a lab technician ever examines closely. Investigators eventually tied the contaminated food to hundreds of confirmed pet deaths, with independent researchers suggesting the true toll ran considerably higher. The mechanism matters here as much as the outcome. Menu Foods didn't fail because it made a bad batch of food. It failed because it trusted an ingredient supply chain it had only ever seen on paper, the same way almost every pet food company still does today. Menu Foods absorbed somewhere around $50 million in direct recall costs, watched its stock price fall by roughly 2/3, and lost somewhere around 80% of its contract manufacturing business within months. A class action settlement followed, running to the tens of millions of dollars. Congress responded by writing new pet food safety testing requirements into federal law that same year, which means every producer in the industry now carries a permanent compliance cost that didn't exist before one contaminated shipment from one overseas supplier. You can run the cleanest kitchen in the industry and still get taken down by a supplier you've only ever dealt with by contract, on a continent you've likely visited 0 times. So, where does the money you make go, once you clear all of that? Food and treats make up the largest single slice of pet spending, somewhere around 40% of the total. Veterinary care and related products run a close second, somewhere around a quarter of all spending. Supplies, over-the-counter medication, and live animal sales make up roughly another fifth. Everything else, grooming, boarding, walking, training, splits the remainder, somewhere under 10%. A long tail of smaller, recurring purchases that add up, over an animal's lifetime, more than any single visit ever could. Total spending across the American pet industry runs somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 to $165 billion a year. Once every downstream job and dollar gets counted, that spending supports an economic footprint of roughly twice that figure, something on the order of 2 to 3 million jobs, well over $100 billion in personal earnings, and somewhere around $20 billion a year in tax revenue. This industry has become large enough that entire local economies quietly lean on it. And here's the number that should worry anyone counting on that revenue showing up when it's genuinely needed. Something like only 1 in 5 pet owners could comfortably cover a $5,000 emergency vet bill out of pocket. Demand for pet care is enormous, and it's also frequently unfunded, which is exactly the gap pet insurance and buy now pay later financing exist to paper over, at a cost. Zoom out from any single year though, and you're looking at something sturdier than a fad you happen to catch at the right moment. Total spending in this industry has climbed for essentially every year tracked since surveys began in the late 1980s, and it's more than doubled just since the early 2010s. That growth isn't riding one demographic or one generation you can count on aging out either. Recent survey data shows people who came to pet ownership decades ago are now expanding their own spending as fast as the newer owners, usually credited with driving the humanization trend, and the customer base you're selling into keeps broadening into categories that used to be niche: birds, reptiles, small mammals, each posting double-digit percentage growth in recent survey waves. You're sitting inside a slow, demographically broad ratchet that only turns one direction, driven less by any single product cycle than by a cultural shift in how people categorize what a pet even is inside a household budget. This is what a category this emotional, this fast-moving, and this thin margin can do to you if you pour capital into it without a plan for profitability. In February of 2000, an online pet supply retailer called Pets.com went public at $11 a share, riding a wave of .com enthusiasm and a beloved sock puppet mascot everyone could name and almost nobody could tell you the business model of. The company raised somewhere around $80 million in that offering alone, on top of tens of millions more raised earlier from venture investors, including a sizable early stake from Amazon's Jeff Bezos. Even before the IPO, the company had spent tens of millions of dollars on advertising, including a single Super Bowl commercial, while collecting only a small fraction of that back in actual sales. And it spent still more buying out a smaller rival pet store, GOM, for around $13 million in stock, just months before both companies' entire category fell apart. It kept selling dog food and cat litter below cost to win customers, because dog food and cat litter are heavy, bulky, and cheap, and shipping them to somebody's door for less than a big box store charges is a losing math problem before you even open the warehouse. By the fall of that same year, Pets.com had lost well over $100 million in 9 months alone. And the capital markets that had funded its growth turned cold overnight, as the wider .com bubble collapsed around it. 268 days after its public offering, the company shut down and liquidated. Somewhere around $300 million of investor money evaporated with it. The rights to that beloved sock puppet later sold at auction for around $125,000. A tidy, almost insulting coda to a company that had once carried a stock market value in the hundreds of millions. Every dollar you spend chasing customer growth in a low-margin, physically heavy category carries a version of this same risk, whether it's 2000 or right now. That mechanism didn't stay buried in the .com era. A dog walking and pet sitting app called WAG built a nationwide gig economy network of independent walkers and sitters, and in 2018, the Japanese investment giant SoftBank poured somewhere around $300 million into the company to fuel rapid growth. Years of losses followed regardless, through a pandemic that gutted demand for in-person dog walking almost overnight. In 2022, WAG merged with a shell company to go public, valued at somewhere around $350 million, still deeply unprofitable. Its main rival, Rover, had gone the same public via shell company route the year before, at a valuation north of $1.5 billion, and Rover's stock struggled on the open market too. The whole gig economy pet services category learned the same lesson, at roughly the same time, from two different companies. The losses at WAG kept coming after that too, on the order of tens of millions of dollars a year, for several years running, until the company eventually filed for bankruptcy protection, handing full ownership over to its lender and wiping out the shareholders who'd bought in along the way. Two very different decades. Two very different business models, one selling kibble online, one selling dog walks through an app. And the identical underlying pattern: pour hype-driven capital into a low-margin, high-churn corner of the pet industry, and sooner or later the capital runs out faster than the business can prove it deserves more. The laxatives in this industry look nothing like a bankruptcy filing. If you build a veterinary practice well, your exit often looks like the entry cost you heard about earlier, just running in reverse. You sell into one of those private equity platforms, roll a slice of your payout into equity in the larger company, and walk away with a payday, plus an ongoing stake. That's the version of an exit you want. The version you don't want plays out somewhere else in the same industry, at the scale of individual animals, rather than individual businesses. Somewhere around 6 million dogs and cats enter American shelters every year, and close to a third of them arrive as direct owner surrenders, separate from the far larger share found as strays. Several 100,000 of those animals don't leave the shelter system alive, even after years of steady improvement pushed the nationwide save rate up from somewhere around 70% a decade ago to somewhere north of 80% today. Sheltering the ones who do get out costs American taxpayers and charities somewhere north of $2 billion a year in operations, medical care, and staffing. Breeding operations exit even less gracefully when they exit badly. A shut-down USDA-licensed breeding facility routinely leaves behind dozens or hundreds of adult breeding animals nobody budgeted to rehome, and its rescue groups, rather than the original owner, who absorbed that final bill. Every loss leader puppy sold at the start of this video eventually generates one of two outcomes: a paying customer for a decade or more, or a line item in somebody else's multi-billion-dollar cleanup budget. On a pure input versus output basis, this industry is a strange, uneven bet, depending on exactly where you stand inside it. And the difference is traced back to a single structural question: does your corner of the business own inventory that can lose value overnight? Or does it just own a relationship? A .com pet retailer or a gig economy pet services app can burn through hundreds of millions of dollars and collapse in under a year because it competes for customer acquisition against rivals with deep pockets and thin loyalty on either side. A pet food manufacturer sits one contaminated shipment away from a recall that can erase decades of brand trust in a single news cycle because its reputation is only ever as strong as its weakest overseas supplier. A breeding operation, or a small independent groomer, runs on the thinnest margins of all, propped up mostly by love of the work, rather than any real financial cushion, because neither one has the scale to spread a bad month across a large customer base. A veterinary clinic, by contrast, is one of the steadiest, most recession-resistant small businesses you can own, precisely because the demand behind it barely bends, even when household budgets do, which is exactly why private equity keeps paying double-digit multiples for clinics, while quietly steering clear of the flashier, more emotionally driven corners of the same industry. Here's what a spreadsheet leaves out, though. Food and water are choke points because bodies need them to survive. Pet spending is a choke point for a completely different reason. Almost nobody wants to be the person who let their dog go hungry, skipped the surgery, or fed the cat something cheap to save $20. One consumer research survey found close to half of pet owners would rather cut their own personal spending or take on debt before cutting their pet's budget. That's identity forcing the purchase, far more than biology ever could. And identity turns out to be every bit as reliable a revenue source as necessity, quarter after quarter, recession after recession. You have to decide for yourself whether a business built on that kind of guilt and devotion sits easy with you. Thin margins, recall risk, and all. The industry was always selling you something bigger than an animal. It sold you a subscription with no cancellation button, dressed up as a free trial with a wagging tail. And somewhere in a spreadsheet, somebody is counting on the fact that you were always going to keep paying,